Okay. Okay, well, thanks, Ali. I'm delighted to start this session with Professor Kieran Keohane, who I think really needs no introduction. So I'm not going to say very much. He's asked me to keep it quick, keep it brief. But I think the thing that I do want to say is that he plays an invaluable role in stimulating conversations on this island with key international figures, and is important in creating this conduit for talk in Ireland about wider trends in social theory and social analysis. But I think that's all I'm going to say. I'm going to introduce him now. So his talk is called After COVID: What Kind of Second Coming, the Nature of the Present Moment and Hopeful Possibilities for a New Normal. So over to you, Kieran.
Thank you, Lisa. And it's very nice to be here. The first SAI conference I was at was in 1988. So, and I've been at actually most of them since then. Can you see my slides there? Is that okay? Okay, very
Yeah.
good. Now, often what happens in conferences, of course, is you submit a title and then you go reworking it and rejigging it. So my title is a bit different from how it appears in the prospectus, and it's kind of exploratory because I've already pre-circulated a paper that was recently published in Constellations. I don't know if you know that journal. It's an American-based journal in contemporary social theory, and it was a kind of an aspirational horizon journal for me when I was a postgraduate student back in the day. And I suppose I want to say that by way of a word of encouragement for people who are, a lot of people here who are kind of starting out in their careers. You know, it's a good idea already if you kind of find a conversation you'd like to be part of and orient towards that. It's a good way to develop yourself, as it were, professionally. So anyway, I suppose being part of a conversation is in some ways what I want to talk about, because I want to talk about influence, right? And how influence works. So my title this time is Good Models and Positive Mimesis. I'll explain a little bit about what mimesis is later on, but it's basically going to center around this, the importance of influence and how influence works. And of course, some of the words I want to play with here then are influence, which of course is the same root as influenza, interestingly, conversation, which means also the kind of turning around, because we live in very, very dark and dangerous times. I know we're having a very nice time at this conference and so on, but and we're in a post-Trump moment. But there's also, there's no doubt about the darkness of our times and so on, and the various kind of cascading crises that we're dealing with in one form or another. So we have to see maybe what's our responsibility and what's our role as sociologists in enabling and shaping a conversation, or thinking about conversations in that sense of turning things around. Related to that are things like metaphor, which means kind of carrying over, carrying forward and so on. I'm using the word called metamorphosis, and how you turn things, how you transform them from within and so on, and how that's related to metanoia. Metanoia is a Greek word. It means kind of the changing of mind. How do we change people's minds, right? In context of polarization, in context of siloization, in the context of post-truth, all of these kind of problems which we're dealing with, the changing of minds, because that takes us to the root of education, educare, which from Plato to the present we understand is a sort of a turning of the soul. So education is no light business. Education is a matter of turning the soul in some way, changing minds. How do we change minds? And metanoia suggests even beyond change of mind, it means change of heart and mind and will. It involves that entire kind of turning around of things. Because always at a time like this, even though we're in a nice celebratory moment here, we have to take seriously the kind of melancholia of our times, and even the melancholy spirit of contemporary sociology, where we are grieving something. What are we grieving? Well, we're grieving, as it were, the ambiguous loss of the death of society. 1987, Margaret Thatcher declared there's no such thing as society. Society is dead. Society is over. It's the end of history, and so on and so forth. Right? And for 40 years, that's the dominant ideology. There's no such thing as society. There's only the individual, etc., etc. So that's a cause of, should be a cause of concern for us. We're closed out then, because the object, our ideal object of investigation has been declared dead. So we have to say, well, how does it? We don't believe that, of course, because we wouldn't be here doing what we're doing if we did. But we have to think in terms of, well, where do we find, as it were, the persistence of society despite its denial, and therefore sociology needs to sort of speak to the persistence of society and the hope for the return of society, or the recovery of society in some way, which confronts a problem of remembering and reminding and reimagining, and how these things are closely related together, because we tend to think of imagination as kind of, we need to dream up something new, we need a new set of ideas, we need a new whatever the hell. But imagination is memory. That's Vico from the New Science, the first text in sociology, let's say. He says imagination is nothing more than the working over of memory. Okay, so they're my two maybe things to begin with, or whatever. Now let's see. So I want to talk now about maybe the kind of contagions we're in. We're when we talk about the COVID pandemic, of course, it's only one, very real and very whatever, but it's only one of the forms of pathological contagions that are characteristic of our age, right? And that's what the paper I circulated has been about, because you think of the other contagions of rage and irrationality and racism and violence and so on and so forth. And it's interesting to think about how those contagions seem to be an entirely different thing from the biological entity, but actually what collects them is the idea of, how contagion spreads mimetically. The virus replicates the virus, replicates the virus, replicates the virus, and so on. And similarly, those contagions of the will, as they were called in the 1930s and 40s, when people were talking about Stalinism and fascism and so on, contagions of the will. These are spread by words that replicate and replicate and replicate and so on and so forth. And very often in the smallest form, the tweet or the meme or something like that. Of course, that's the fundamental source of the way in which the new politics of Trump, of Brexit, and so on and so forth spread. Very important to take those things into account. And the paper I circulated to you is kind of about that. And it takes up two general themes. One is two theoretical ideas that help us understand and explain what's been going on there. One is the paradigm of mimesis and the contagion of envy and rivalry and so on from this man, René Girard, whom I'll talk about in a moment. And the second one, the sort of antidote to that, is the account or the paradigm of gift exchange and reciprocity associated with Marcel Mauss. And Marcel Mauss, René Girard is probably obscure to many of you. Marcel Mauss, similarly, maybe so, although maybe a little bit less so. But Mauss was Durkheim's nephew and a really key player in the emergence of sociology in the day. Remembered more as an anthropologist and a sociologist, but absolutely vital to us as a sort of a general theory of the good, a general theory of social solidarity based on this general economy of reciprocity and the gift. Now, I want to say also another, because we all have influences, I guess, and an influential figure for me is this guy, Walter Benjamin. And Walter Benjamin, an extraordinary interesting person, because he emerges also from that moment that we're seeing now a sort of a repetition of in the 1930s. And he eventually suicided rather than be captured by the Gestapo and so on. And shortly before he died, he wrote a very interesting series called The Theses on the Philosophy of History. And one of the pieces I want to take from him here is he talks about, all of the struggles that are going on in his time as they are in ours for the material things. We can think about the struggles around Black Lives Matter, the struggles around class and inequalities and all of these things. He says these struggles for material things are the basis on which all refined and spiritual things could exist. In other words, like we have to, as it were, deal with both of these things. And he says in that context, when we're thinking about the refined and subtle things that are hugely important at the level of ideas and so on and so forth, he says the role of kind of the historian or the sociologist, you can say, is to think in terms of how the metaphor he uses, how flowers turn towards the sun, right? And he says, it's a very interesting, just, it's a sort of fundamental transformation, but it's also very inconspicuous. So I'm going to suggest to you that one of the challenges for kind of a sociology in these present times is to try to orient towards those small things, small influences that can make a very big difference. He similarly talked about himself, and at some point he likened himself to an engineer driving a train on a runaway locomotive or whatever. He says, it's out of control, but we need only make a tiny adjustment and you can change, as it were, the whole apparatus. So sometimes we find ourselves as sociologists trying to address the macro, you know, the big issues, the class struggle, the political economy, the rifts in history and so on and so forth. And Benjamin is drawing our attention to making these, as it were, small adjustments and small changes and so on, because that's where influencers work. Let me mention here two models and good influences that are friends of ours here in the Sociological Association of Ireland, and influences to me and influences to all of us here. And this man is Tom Inglis. And I want to suggest that he published an article in the Irish Journal of Sociology just 2 years ago called Webs of Meaning. And in my view, it's the best thing that we've published out of Irish sociology, and certainly in the Irish Journal of Sociology. Extraordinarily subtle, detailed, attuned analysis to these small things that are vitally important. Kind of the substratum of society, the life world, you might say, in that tradition, and how it works, how it's always there, despite its being denied. And he talks about it as the moral ground of society. We all have this kind of moral responsibility to create and to recreate a shared sense of meaning, right? And it's very important to bear that in mind when all of the life world is being overwritten by codes, right? By binary codes, by divisive codes, by Boolean codes, by algorithms and so on and so forth, that, as it were, seek to erase and overwrite all that coding. So Tom Inglis is kind of reminding us, as it were, that that code persists despite it's being denied, and we have to, as it were, we can find the basis of hope by looking for the small changes that are taking place there. The second influence I want to mention is our colleague Kathleen Lynch, a sociologist, though she works mostly in the field of education and equality studies and so on and so forth. And she has a book coming out this summer. She shared a small piece with me. I was very grateful for that. And it's about Capitalism and Care is the title of the book. I'm not sure, I think the publisher is Routledge. And in this book, Kathleen Lynch identifies, you know, the keystone of any social system. And the keystone of the social system we've been convinced or persuaded, or tried to be persuaded at least, is the figure of the rational choice subject, Homo economicus. You know, so society is dead. There only exists this rational choice subject, and so on. And Kathleen Lynch and others also have been doing the work, as it were, to counter a century and a half of patriarchal bias in the anthropological argument and so on, that favors the individual, to show us that rather than Homo economicus as the individual rational choice subject, there is, as it were, the more universal and long-lived notion of the human subject as homines curans, which means caring people. You know, so that becomes a hugely important thing to bear in mind, to mobilize an argument against the overwhelming hegemony of the neoliberal argument about the subject. Now, so if there's some of our influences, and I'm encouraging you all as Irish sociologists to kind of work with our good influences there and familiarize yourself with these people and so on. I'll mention also models and bad influences, right? And this takes me back to the man I introduced at the beginning, René Girard. And René Girard is the guy who emphasizes, as it were, that the foundational human and political relationship is one of envy and rivalry and conflict that spirals towards violence and so on. And this man in the blue t-shirt, alongside him is a Silicon Valley prince. His name is Peter Thiel. And Peter Thiel was a student of René Girard. He was the initial investor, the capital funder for Facebook. His main company is Palantir, which is the central operating apparatus, let's say, of the CIA, of all of this kind of thing. And he's also a very, very influential figure. How is he influential? Well, he bridges and he parlays this theory from René Girard directly to Trump and the Republican Party, right? You know, now it's interesting to see, well, you know, how are we responsible for our ideas, right? You know, is that the Girard support all that? We'll leave that for a while, but we'll just see how his influence through Thiel becomes the influence that shapes the electoral strategy that brought us Trump, not only brought us Trump, but also brought us Brexit, because this is also the mastermind behind Cambridge Analytica, the distortions of communications and so on and so forth. So you can see how important a figure, an obscure meeting, a former graduate student becomes in shaping the world that we're in at the moment, right? Now, and this is René Girard, and he says, okay, so the world is constituted by conflicts and tensions and so on, that resolves itself into sacrificial crises of violence. That's a picture of an infamous lynching in the 1920s, I think, in Texas. But of course, this is what we've seen all the way through to George Floyd and so on and so forth. And this is Girard's insight. He sees how already existing divisions and conflicts within society can be protected through the agency of sacrificial violence vented on another, so that everybody becomes united against the other and so on. Now, so with this kind of logic key that he brings into the Republican Party and so on, it becomes the basis for the new politics. The new politics being, okay, let's create division where there's already latent division that's not yet explicit and overt and so on and so forth. Let's foster that and ferment that and so on. And you can see the way in which the president used Twitter and used just words and so on. I have a friend in New York who talked to me about the strange transformation of Trump's influence. This is long before it melted down into overt fascism, where people felt, well, if the president can use the N-word, for example, or if the president can use this, that, and the other, then it's okay for everybody to use it. Right? And that was very deliberate, systematic use of words, just words, code words, dog whistle politics, it got called, and all of this kind of things and so on. Well, that's how influence works. And Girard is the guy who says, right, so what you do then on the basis of that, on the basis of scapegoating, is you create that division, and on that basis, people will look for an exalted authority to step in and restore order. And that becomes, as it were, then the strategy for the authoritarian restoration, whether in Trump's America or in Brazil or wherever. It's the same basic logic. Now, but I promised I wasn't going to go down the dark road. I wanted to highlight the others. The other side of that is this man, Marcel Mauss. Marcel Mauss should be especially interesting to us at the moment because he really came of age, in the aftermath of the Spanish flu. He'd been through the World War I. He'd been injured several times. He spent a lot of time in care, and he spent a lot of time in giving care. And he worked as a translator, which is very, very interesting. In fact, his real anthropological interest is formed by that. You know, how do you communicate between allies who speak 4, 5, 6 different languages? Even in France at the time, the French army spoke different dialects that required the work of translation so that they could communicate and so on and so forth. So these are his interests, for instance. But what he picks up from his experience of being a receiver of care and a gift and a returner of care. He took care of his mother and through a long illness. His wife was chronically ill for 50 years, and so on. So he's a caregiver and a care receiver is the basis of the gift relation as a sort of a future-oriented giving up, life-affirming expenditure investment in intergenerational solidarity. This is what he all understood. And Mauss, either explicitly or implicitly, became the sociologist who provided the theoretical basis for what we know as the European social model, or the European welfare state. In France especially, but also influential in Britain, also influential in Germany, and so forth. So, and now, not so much forgotten, but in need of being remembered. Because Mauss's argument, of course, is, well, this is the only antidote to contagious viral spreads of violence and so on and so forth, is to reinstitute the relations of the gift. He was also very interested in positive forms of mimesis, and I'll come to that in a moment, because sometimes, especially inherited from René Girard, we think of mimesis, because his theory is so strong and so encompassing, that it's always a bad thing, you know, that mimesis always spirals towards, you know, negative animosities and rivalries and sacrificial violence and so on and so forth. But Mauss shows how, as I'm trying to indicate here with some of these, with this picture, whatever, that all learning, that mimesis is essential in this way. And what's very important in that is, as it were, the prestige of the person who performs the authorized, ordered action that's emulated. So that comes back to the idea of the model. And you don't just have kind of a bad model, you have these very good models also. And I'd like to suggest that really this is kind of how we need to imagine thinking our way out of the terrible messes we've gotten ourselves into. We need to think of influences that are subtle and small but transformative, and also models, good models that people orient to and emulate and so on. In Katie's Hayward's talk this morning, for instance, very, very interesting to see the way in which we're stuck at the moment for models of good leadership, who can do that kind of, play that role of that can be positively emulated and so on. Right? We need to think about that, but and then the proliferation, of course, of poor models, but always there is the possibility and the necessity of being able to identify better models. And I'm taking all this from one of the guys who I think is probably one of the most interesting people working in theory at the moment. This is a fellow called Nidesh Latu at the University of Louvain. And he's the principal investigator of a big project on homomimesis, which I'll just flag for you and bring to your attention. And he has a new book about the new fascism, and he talks about it in terms of contagion and so on. And one of his collaborators on that is this guy. His name is Christoph Wolff at the University of Berlin. Very important book on mimesis, showing, taking on board all that Girard says, but also emphasizes and shows up this universality of mimesis. All learning is by imitation, Aristotle says. And in this sense, then we have to think very seriously about who are our models that can become emulated and so on. I'm going to just show a couple of models, and hopefully they'll make some sense to you. So here's a modeling relationship, right? So the model isn't just a replication of what came before. This is Adorno, and this is Judith Butler, whom you probably recognize. And these are kind of generally regarded as the most influential figures in social theory in the last 75 years, at least high up there amongst them. And here we have Adorno, and he's writing, of course, in despair at the end of the Holocaust and all of that, and anticipating the Cold War and so on. He says, and Adorno says, there's only one thing that's certain now, which is the irrationality of society has reached a point where only the gloomiest predictions have any plausibility. And that's in some way part of the inheritance of the melancholy of contemporary sociology, right? You know, you kind of say, oh my God, you know, all we can do is point out and keep pointing out the disaster. And he poses a very interesting question in that same book. He says, the problem is that wrong life cannot be lived rightly. In other words, it's impossible to live the good life when history is all wrong in that way. Now, Judith Butler was awarded the Adorno Prize a couple of years ago, and she takes up the challenge of answering that question. Do we have to be so melancholic? Is there any hope, and so on? And she says, well, how we turn Adorno's question around, how we convert it in some way into a more hopeful direction, is by not focusing on, that existential question of, is it possible that an individual lived a good life or whatever, but rather show how that's a political question. And that becomes, that question can only be raised and addressed collectively. And she says, our shared exposure to precarity is the ground of our potential equality and our reciprocal obligations to produce together conditions of livable life. She wrote this just on the eve of kind of Trump, actually, which is sort of interesting. No, so I want to give you just a couple of examples of this. And here's an interesting one, because I'm conscious of the Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland thing and so on and so forth. And the role of somebody like Casement in the history of the empire, and particularly the articulation. He's the first guy who really explicates and makes clear human rights, right? Everything that we have about universal human rights, we owe to Casement in some way. And Conrad, Joseph Conrad and Casement were together in the Congo. They're almost like doubles in history. They're almost close fellow travelers. Conrad, a refugee from Russia, Casement, and they're both serving in the British Marine. They're both working in the Congo on behalf of the empire in one way or the other. And then they discover through their conversation something very important. Joseph Conrad says about Casement, he says, Casement was a man who could tell you things I've tried to forget, things I never did know. And this was what Casement was telling Conrad, of course, was that the British Empire, which he loved, because Conrad was, an Anglophile in the strongest sense, a refugee from Russia. He saw this a good way, and so on. But Casement changed his mind, and he changed his mind by just telling him what he saw in the Congo and how everybody was implicated in that. And Casement himself changed his mind also. He began as a loyal servant of the crown and so on and so forth, but then he began to realize that he was seeing through the world through other people's eyes and so on. He tried to, well, that's another story that I won't get into. Nidesh Law 2, by the way, has, if you want to read one piece of his that's really important, read The Shadow Line, and it's an analysis in Conrad's work of, if you like, Casement's influence, which is interesting. Casement's influence appears most of all, of course, in the figure of Kurtz in The Heart of Darkness, right? As this Kurtz means kind of the promise of European enlightenment, the promise of all of these things cut short. Kurtz is short, and so on. And James Joyce takes this up in Ulysses as the center, the pivot around which Ulysses turns is this exploration of, how contagion spreads and how you can respond to spreading contagion. And it's in the chapter, if you've read Ulysses, or if you want to just read one piece, read the Cyclops chapter, right? Because it's about this. And it centers around this figure of the nameless person who is the protagonist and the narrator, and he's the I. And he is a fly man. He's a man who's a fly, a bar fly, who picks up contagion from the street, contagion in the form of gossip, in the forms of filth, in the forms of the bad word, right? And he brings that in and he spreads that. So there's already division, there's already animosity, and there's already colonial resentment in the bar. But this guy, Flyman, he spreads it, and that's how contagion spreads. And he spreads it quietly by the word, by always having the bad word, right? In fact, he appears as kind of Beelzebub, like the demonic form of the fly who spreads filth and evil and corruption by this one. And in that context, oh my God, have I got about 5 minutes?
I'm gonna wrap it up, yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Well, I just see, I'll skip on a few now here. I wanted to maybe talk about this, about influence. Two ways to look at mimesis, right, and influence. One we have in Shakespeare, best represented in Shakespeare, which is dropping the poisonous word, right? And in Hamlet, of course, you have, the corruption that poisons the whole ear of Denmark with his words, right? That's one. And another one that's quite different. So that's how evil, negative mimesis spreads by the evil word. In the tweet, in a statement, in a script, in whatever. And positive mimesis is represented here in Leonardo's representation of the Annunciation, which is impregnation via the ear. Very, very interesting. So how does the good news enter the world? Through the impregnation of the ear. Extraordinary in terms of enunciation and conception, from which we have concept, the idea, and so on and so forth. Now, and it's very interesting the way Leonardo, almost uniquely amongst artists, represents the angel, as it were, on the same level or speaking up to Mary. So it's kind of a democratic, egalitarian form of communication. I'm going to finish down this. What good influences and good models then can we see in a contemporary context? Well, one of the good models is, of course, we're a lot of talking about the New Deal. Are we entering into a New Deal era? Are we entering into a Green New Deal, and so on and so forth? Well, the person associated with the Green Deal is always FDR, but FDR was just a cipher, right? The real influence, the person who made the Green New Deal were sociologists, Veblen amongst them, but crucially this woman. She was Frances Perkins from the sociology department at the University of Columbia, who had the president's ear. And it was she who gave him the idea and fed him all the ideas. All his words are basically Frances Perkins' words. Extraordinarily interesting thing to look into. And behind her, by the way, is a fellow woman called, known to us as Mother Jones. So it's really interesting how a word passes on and passes on. And of course, in a contemporary context, that influence, that model is AOC, right? As eloquent, as articulate, and so on. It's very interesting to listen to her speak. And of course, she speaks for and in the ear of a president, famously with prone to gaffes, saying the wrong thing, right, at the wrong time, and also with a speech impediment. So she becomes, as it were, the progressive influence that puts the words in his ear and speaks for them. And I'll finish with this in my last thing now. I want to kind of suggest that if we were to imagine convening an influential conversation that really needs to happen, it might be this kind of conversation involving across the generations, from Mary Robinson to Thunberg to van der Leyen to AOC. That is it's from that kind of conversation that these parties might influence one another, because they're limited in various ways, but they, as it were, need to have that kind of conversation so that the European Green New Deal wouldn't be the sterile, bureaucratic, technocratic jargon that it falls into as its default position, and